We're going to look at Elisha and Elijah. So we'll have the first thing up. And I've got a text. And as the text is 2 Kings 2 verse 2, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. I will not leave you. We've got two passages to read. They're quite long, but they link, and it's quite important that we see them. It's 1 Kings 19 and 15 to 21, and 2 Kings chapter 2, 1 to 18. And I'll read them out. So we'll start at 1 Kings 19 and 15. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came, this is to Elijah, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king of Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king of Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, he said, and then I will come with you. Go back, Elijah replied. What have I done to you? So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the ploughing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his attendant. And then we start in 2 Kings chapter 2, which is the sometime later when Elijah is on his way to meet God. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elisha and Elisha were on their way to Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel. But Elisha said, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, do you not know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, Elisha replied, but do not speak of it. Then Elijah said to him, stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho. And he replied, surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. So then they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, do you not know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, he replied, but do not speak of it. Then Elijah said to him, stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. So the two of them walked on. 50 men of the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken, it will be yours, otherwise not." As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them apart. He picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. The company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. "Look," they said, "we, your servants, have 50 able men. Let them go and look for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and set him down on some mountain or some valley." "No," Elisha replied, "do not send them." But they persisted until he was too ashamed to refuse. So he said to them, "Send them." And they sent 50 men who searched for 3 days, but did not find him. When they returned to Elisha, who was staying in Jericho, he said to them, "Didn't I tell you not to go?" A few weeks ago, Joan spoke to us about Moses and his development in leading God's people out of Egypt. Moses spent 80 years being developed. He spent 40 years in the palace, in luxury, and then 40 years looking after sheep for his father-in-law, Jethro, prior to God using him. And today we're looking at how Elisha developed from being a farmer to being God's prophet for a new generation after Elijah. Elisha was Elijah's apprentice. God calls us to follow him, and in these passages we show us how Elisha progressed from a man who was later described as the man who poured water over Elijah's hands. He didn't do much, he just poured water over his hands, to being God's man for his time. As Elisha follows Elijah on his way to being taken into heaven, Elisha and his calling are tested. And these tests are outlined out like this. The first one is the test of loyalty and love. The second test, the test of loneliness. And the third one, the test of faith. And the final one, the test of ambition. So that's what we're going to look at this morning. Those 4 tests that Elisha was subject to as he walked with Elijah. Now, the test of love and loyalty is quite fundamental. Commitment is at the very core of our calling. And here we see the development of Elijah's love and loyalty to Elijah and Elijah's God. We need to be loyal and love where God has placed us. The trouble today is Christians only want short-term commitments. We definitely don't want anything that's painful. Being a Christian is all or nothing. Being a son of God means you are also his servant. Excuse me, I just have to... One of the most important things we need to understand about being a Christian is this. You cannot be reconciled to God without being recruited into his service. I'll say that again. You cannot be reconciled to God without being recruited into his service. Becoming a follower of Jesus makes demands on us. Do not think that it is simply a question of believing. It is about faith, love, commitment, and sacrifice. Somebody said, sacrifice is the ecstasy of giving the best we have to the one we love the most. God decides history, not man. He had 7,000 people who had not bowed the knee to Baal. He has people everywhere and who are waiting in the wings, waiting for their cue to play their part. But the call from God has to be genuine. Otherwise, it will not sustain us when things are difficult. Now, do not be anxious. God can change the world in a heartbeat. God has people all over, and they're getting ready to do his bidding when he prompts. There are 3 exchanges recorded in the passages in verses 2, 4, and 6 of 2 Kings 2. 2 Kings 2:2 says, Elijah said to Elisha, stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel. And Elisha said, as surely as the Lord lives and you live, I will not leave you. 2 Kings 2 and verse 4. Then Elijah said to him, stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives, I will not leave you. And then in verse 6, then Elijah said to him, stay here, the Lord has sent me to Jordan. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. 3 times Elijah says, stay here. And I believe that was a test of Elisha's commitment to being a follower of God and to the man of God who had called him. We see here that Elisha is in a covenant relationship to God and to Elijah. Today we see too much convenient love, as long as it suits me, and not enough covenant love, whether I feel like it or not. Covenant love, whether I feel like it or not. Some people even spiritualize their decision and say, God has told me to move on. They say the burden for this place has been removed from me. It may be the voice of God, but mostly it simply amounts to, I feel like I just want to go. 2 things tie Elisha to Elijah. His reverent fear of the Lord and his love for Elijah. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. He's in covenant love. It's an healthy thing in relationships when there is no option. That divorce is no option. And I don't just mean about marriage. There is no option for us. Loyalty is a decision of the will. Are you loyal in your friendships? Loyal in your marriage? Loyal in your place of work? And loyal to your church? The second test we come across is the test of loneliness. 2 Kings 2 and verse 3 to 5 says, the company of the prophets came out to Elisha and asked, do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, Elisha replied, but do not speak of it. Then Elijah said to him, stay here, Elisha, the Lord has sent me to Jericho. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets of Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, but do not speak of it. If we remain in a correct relationship with God, then there will be times when the vision we have means we are walking alone. And that especially applies to those in leadership. The prophets of the school at Bethel must have thought they were being helpful, but they did not see the hand of God at work. The school of the prophets knew Elisha and perhaps were jealous of that relationship with Elijah. 50 members of the company of prophets stood apart. Elisha must have felt alone and not supported by these prophets. Here there is a testing of Elisha's relationship with God and an understanding of his responsibility for God's purposes. Elisha must have been stung by the tones. Do you not know the Lord is going to take your master away from you? They imply how Elisha would be less when Elijah is gone. It is a test of his own relationship with God. Elisha was faced with a sense of the responsibility which was shortly to be his. The school of the prophets had Elijah as the overall leader, and they wonder if Elijah was going to be up to the task. Shortly, no longer could Elisha think, what would Elisha do? And I'm glad I'm not the leader. And in his shoes, but he would have to hear from God and make the decisions. He would be on his own. So the two of them walked on. 50 men of the company of the prophets, it says, went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. The company of the prophets stood at a distance. Shows to Elisha that he really is on his own. The third test is the test of faith. The Christian faith is unashamedly supernatural. We believe in a God who intervenes directly into our world and into our lives. When the supernatural is manifested, then it is scary and never safe. C.S. Lewis, in his classic fantasy, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, is a powerful allegory of Christ's war with Satan. The children, Peter, Edmund, Susan and Lucy, have entered Narnia, the magical land held in the icy grip of a usurper witch, the White Queen. Why is she white? The legitimate ruler, Aslan, is on the move to reconquer his kingdom. And Mr. Beaver is explaining to the children who Aslan is. I tell you, he's the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Ooh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Then you will, dearie, and no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without knees knocking, then either they're braver than most, or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Didn't you hear what Mrs. Beaver told you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Says in 2 Kings. 50 men of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it, divided it to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. Elijah showed his relationship to God and his faith in crossing the Jordan. Elisha risked being shunned by his fellow believers and falling into excess. Elisha, like all of us, had to go out on a limb in his faith. The first thing Elisha risked was being shunned by his peers. The company of prophets were at a safe distance, just in case. If the Jordan had not parted, then they would have been quick to say, we were right and you were wrong, Elisha. We are the ones people should listen to. Denominations today would probably say, can we have an explanation? And about you bringing our church into disrepute. The second thing Elisha risked was about falling into excess. Now, can you imagine if John here says he's going to go to the River Ouse in York, get his coat, whack it down, and it's going to part. I can see the number of people accompanying him would be quite small. If it didn't work, then the headline in the papers next day would be quite something. Crazy man hits River Ouse with rolled up coat. Very embarrassing, and his reputation would be in tatters. But we have to risk things if we're going to grow in God. Jesus said, everything is possible for him who believes. The third thing Elisha risked was going out on a limb. The other side of Jordan was not safe, and it was foreign and enemy-occupied territory. Remember, it's always out on a limb that you'll gather the best fruit. Besides risking 3 things, Elisha had 3 things he had to keep doing if he was going to reach his goal and progress from being an apprentice to being God's prophet. The first thing he had to do was keep walking. You cannot arrive at a destination unless you keep walking. Elisha had to keep walking with Elijah if he was going to inherit the mantle. The second thing he had to do was keep talking. To know God, you have to communicate with him. Talking with God helps us to know what he is like. You have to let God and God's servants speak to you of God's character. And you have to change to be like him. The third thing he had to do was keep watching. Without seeing what God is doing, then you will not progress to being God's man or God's woman for God's time. Remember, it is as you look in the mirror, you are changed. 2 Corinthians says, we all, with open face, looking in a glass, see the glory of the Lord, and are changed in the same image from glory to glory, even as the Spirit of the Lord. Now, the fourth test is the test of ambition. And when they had crossed, it says in verse 9, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" And Elijah's questions, "Tell me what I can do for you," gives Elisha an opportunity to voice his ambition and to follow God and his calling. It appears that Elijah was giving his young apprentice a blank check. What would he write in the box? What amount would he fill in? This is the test of ambition. Now, ambition is not bad in itself. Ambition is aspiration or hope we have for our lives in the future. It is a form of faith, but it can be either spiritual or carnal in origin. Carnal ambition would have prompted Elisha to ask for fame, travel, financial security, and all the kudos from a top-selling book and conference ministry. Elijah did not want any of these things. He didn't want a double portion of Elijah's air miles. He didn't want his salary or his YouTube sales. He only wanted a double portion of his spirit. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. "You have asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours, otherwise not." Now let's remember, the double portion is the inheritance of the firstborn son in a Hebrew household. It says in Deuteronomy, "He must acknowledge the son of his unlived wife as the firstborn by giving him a double share of all he has." Elisha wanted to be regarded as Elijah's heir or successor. He wanted to be his son. He knew what this meant and was prepared to take up the challenge. It says in 2 Kings 2:13-14, "He picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and struck the water with it. 'Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?' he asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. The secret of knowing God is being where he is and where he wants you to be. The company of the prophets, when Elisha hit the river as Elijah did, now knew Elisha was God's man. Elisha had passed the tests. He was now God's man. He passed the test of loyalty, the test of loneliness, the test of faith, and the test of ambition. He had passed the tests and inherited the mantle of Elisha and became God's man for his time. And it's no different for us. We need to pass our tests when God calls us to move on and to do things. Being God's man and in God's way will always mean fulfilment of God's calling. So that's what Elisha has found out. And it's what we need to find out as we follow him. Amen.